Welcome, everyone. I'm Oliviero Angeli, the scientific coordinator of the Migration Forum, Mercato Forum Migrazione and Democratie. And I'm very delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Reiljan, from the EUI in Florence. We very much appreciate that you are here, as we know that you had a very long trip from Estonia to Dresden. The last time you gave your talk on Zoom, but it's much better to have you here today. Just a few words of introduction. Andres did his PhD at the UI in Florence, and is now again at the UI as a postdoctoral fellow, as a Max Weber fellow. Before, he was in Estonia working on a project at the University of Tartu, where he led a project funded by the Estonian Research Council. Despite being a young scholar, he's one of the most quoted experts on affective polarization, a topic that is of great interest to us as well. And that's why we are very much delighted to listen to your talk today here in Dresden. Before we start, a quick note for those who are connected online. This session is going to be recorded, and we plan to make it available afterwards for those who couldn't attend today. And I should also add that there will be a Q&A session following Anders' presentation. That's it. Thank you again for coming, Andres. We very much look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliviero, for a very nice introduction, and also for this invitation. I very much agree that it's much nicer to be here in person. My first time in Dresden. It appears that I arrived at a very interesting time. It took me like 10 minutes being here when I already saw an AFD protest and several other protests. So I think it's a good scene for affective polarization presentation. And I will get to the topic of far right and affective polarization. I will get to that also. But in general, today I'll try to give a bit of a broad comparative perspective on affective polarization, how to define it and how to compare it, because there's a lot of research coming up on it now, but I think some very basic things are still kind of not only unsolved, but also a bit like under-addressed. So it's a kind of a broad focus talk, but I'm very happy to go way more into all kinds of details in the discussion later. So to start, I will first try to explain a bit what is affective polarization. I think most people here in the room and in the Zoom probably have an idea about it already, because the topic has been gaining of popularity in the recent years. But to put it very simply, affective polarization in the most general level is a group-based polarization in feelings. So meaning that people are divided into groups that are hostile towards each other, that people hold certain positive feelings towards some in-group and negative feelings towards some out-group. So I think South Park is always a good way to summarize affective polarization, because it's very much built on this idea of people dividing into groups and being incredibly angry at each other. And so yeah, I think generally that summarizes what it is. You have one group of people, and other group, they have certain like identifiers, so you could see who's on what side, and they clearly don't like each other. But there's always some people kind of in the middle who don't care that much about politics. So even in the most polarized societies, should keep in mind that not everyone is in these groups is polarized. There are just many people who don't care. But I think generally this is how what summarizes it. And the groups could be based on whatever common identity, but most of the literature, most of what we've been working on in the last years is about partisan affective polarization. So these groups that people are divided in are based on the political party. And I know here in MIDEM, we also work now on issue-based affective polarization, which I think is a very interesting direction. My own research has so far lied more on the partisan approach, so I will also today talk more about that, but again, very happy to expand it in the discussion. So affective polarization, I guess if you go to conferences, if you see what is being published, it's kind of like a new big thing in the political science lately. Everyone's talking about it. When I think I gave my first presentation on the topic in 2016, and then no one knew about it at all in Europe, at least. And now kind of everyone in the comparative politics knows about it. So it is really from almost being a very obscure, unknown concept, because it was used also in the 1960s, 70s, but it never really got any traction. But since the Iyengar et al. Paper 2012, it really started proliferating. Europe and the rest of the world was a bit lagging behind of the United States, but now it's very much going on there too. So that's just like the number of publications that mention affective polarization has really gone from around 0 to over 1,000 in less than a decade. So it's quite remarkable. So, and I'm not sure who. If someone wants to claim this quote, then please do. But I'm not sure who authored this. But many are saying now that it's like the new populism, which they have prompted this meme that is making rounds on Twitter. I guess some of you have seen it already. Meaning that that kind of everyone in the political science was studying populism, and now suddenly in the last few years everyone's turning on affective polarization. So it's really moving fast, and if you go to any conference now, like in Europe too, there's whole panels and even sections dedicated to it. But I guess similarly to populism, it's always the issue. Like I think with populism, also the word that has been really overused and maybe sometimes misused. And I think affective polarization might be going a bit into this direction, meaning that there's a lot of research on it, but not that much like conceptual debates. It's just mostly people say, okay, I study affective polarization, and then they present their data and do some models. But I think there are things that are still kind of unresolved. I know last month in the same lecture series you had Lena Reiljan here, who wrote a brilliant article which was recently published in Electoral Studies about several open debates on it. So she also touched upon this, but I think one of the central kind of issues that I think needs more like conceptual debate is whether like the so-called real affective polarization is it about feelings towards party elites, or ordinary citizens who support the parties. So just, I put here just some definitions that I gathered from the papers. You don't have to read all of them. The point is that in some of them they mention clearly partisans, in others they mention parties, and this is still kind of an open debate. It seems that it's rather leaning towards the let's say the horizontal option, or that it's more between ordinary citizens, which I agree it's also that, but at the same time I don't see why we should kick this part, the parties and the elites part, why we should kick this out of this umbrella term of affective polarization. So what I propose, and I have already also published something on it, is that we should treat affective polarization as a multidimensional concept. So very generally, we could distinguish between political dimension, which would entail polarized feelings towards and between parties, party elites, and social dimension, which would be then the polarized feelings towards and between, let's say, ordinary people, ordinary citizens based on their party or whichever political affiliation. So yeah, that's like a very simple way of dividing the concept into two. I think they are clearly not the same thing. I see often now like that in some research they use like measures of the political dimension and say that it's like a proxy of the social dimension, which is the actual affective polarization. I think we should rather just accept that there are different dimensions of this phenomenon. They might have different consequences and foundations. They are clearly correlated. Of course, I will get to that later. So yeah, this is a graph from Lena's paper. So she has conceptualized it as like a horizontal and vertical dimension. Also, some others like Helco Harteveld have come up with this kind of a conceptualization, which I also think works well. Maybe the one difference between this vertical, horizontal, and the political and social that I'm proposing is that in this, if you talk about the vertical and horizontal, we only think about, let's say, like a ordinary citizen or like the voter level. But I think we could also think of affective polarization as between party elites, or like what do party elites or politicians actually feel about other parties and their voters, because it can always be that it's kind of like a show to the voters to play that they are very polarized while actually they just want to make a living out of it. Or is it that there is a general animosity also at the political elite level? So I think we can also measure. I don't know really of any papers yet. I've worked a bit on it and published in Swedish on it. I don't even speak Swedish, but in a chapter on elite affective polarization, as there is some data where they ask actually members of parliament how they feel about different parties. But generally, this is still a very unexplored area. But I think at least conceptually, we can also think of, let's say, a horizontal dislike between political elites, or vertical in a way like how political elites feel about different voter groups. So but the main takeaway would be that the political and social dimension of affective polarization, they're not the same thing, and I think we should not treat them as the same thing. They might and most likely are quite strongly correlated, and yeah, I will get back to that later. But I think we should rather think of affective polarization as a multidimensional concept. And at least my take is that the political dimension has a place on it too. I know many people disagree, and I'm happy to debate it. But the way I see it is that also the political or the vertical dimension fulfills the criteria, I would say, of being affective polarization. Okay, so when that's out of the way, so what I will focus on now is providing a broad comparative perspective regarding the political dimension of affective polarization, also because we really do not have broad comparative data yet on the more social manifestations of it. And I think there are still many open questions on the political dimension, and I'll get to that. I will discuss a bit the potential implications of affective polarization on democracy. Is it necessarily a bad thing, or which type of affective polarization is more dangerous to democracy? And I also have some data that I collected in my recent project in Estonia, but not only in Estonia, I collected also in a few other countries on the more social types of affective polarizations. I will also in the end present that and analyze the relationship a bit between the two dimensions. So talking about comparing affective polarization in multi-party systems, it's not that simple, because that's what I've been really working on for quite some years now, is like how to adapt this concept from the US two-party system when they started studying it. So in the US, the two-party system, it's pretty simple. It's one dimension of conflict. So this is like, let's say, a like-dislike matrix of what do Democrat voters think of Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and the vice versa. So you can just put it like this: that it's like a 1-2-dimensional map of two dimensions, of two parties and their voters. What do they think of each other? And then you can measure their distance. So it's quite clear. But in a multi-party system, basically the number of potential dimensions, I'm saying potential because not all parties are actually in conflict with each other, but it's n times n minus 1 divided by 2 dimensions of conflict. So what it means, for example, this is Sweden, 2018, 8 parties in the parliament. All of them are quite relevant, as in all of them could decide who gets the prime ministership. So they all have certain leverage. So you have 8 parties, which would mean that there is 28 different potential conflict dimensions. So these kind of dimensions here, there's 28 of them. It is obviously way more complicated to then compare polarization or the levels of polarization across these party systems with maybe 5 or 6 or even 8 or 9 relevant parties. So how can we compare? I would say very generally, we can speak of 2 main approaches. One is that I have outlined myself some years ago already, which could be said that affective polarization, kind of like a sum of all parties and conflicts. So the degree of polarization is determined by the number of active conflict dimensions. So in how many of these dimensions, like for example, 28 dimensions in an 8-party system, how many of them are actually active in terms of that voters dislike each other on this dimension, then how intense are the feelings, and the relative important size of the polarized parties. Marcus Wagner has developed his, 2 indices, but what he presented as the main one, the spread of score index, kind of conceptualizes affective polarization as the extent to which politics is seen as divided into 2 distinct camps, each of which may consist of 1 or more parties. So even if it's more parties than 2, we are looking at like a division into 2 camps. So to summarize, to get again this kind of a matrix, then I would see all of these dimensions, all of these potential cells, like what do the voters of Green Party think of the Liberal, what do they think about the Sweden Democrats, as a potential dimension of conflict, and then I will see what is the actual sum of the conflicts, what is the average feelings between different groups. Whereas Wagner's approach rather puts all of this into 1 dimension and see whether all these feelings go into like two camps, into 2 sides. So when I see, let's say, like a 28 dimensions like that, and for Wagner's approach, it's more like a 1 general dimension. What difference does it make empirically? There are just some examples of the rankings of the countries. Turkey always comes up. This is leader polarization. This is party, and this is Wagner's also party polarization. Turkey is always up there. Philippines, Taiwan, Netherlands, like Southeast Asian countries, Netherlands, Finland are usually in the lower end. Because here the higher is the least polarized, and here the higher is most polarized. So it's a bit confusing. So there are certain commonalities, but also the 2 indexes, they don't correlate. Far from perfect. So this is now with the newest data I have, the Wagner's index and my index, and the R-square is still, less than 0.5. So let's say half of the variation is unexplained between remains kind of unclear. Why is it that in some countries they kind of show higher in this approach that I've outlined, and in some others the Wagner's approach. So I'm only starting my work on it, but I have a little bit work on it now in Europe. So this is Central Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Northwestern Europe. And the main takeaway here would be that if you look at the sum of conflicts, the index that I proposed, then Central Eastern and Southern Europe on average look way more polarized than Northwestern European countries. But if you look at the spread of scores, so this is the shortest bar here, the spread of scores, the Wagner's index, they are virtually equal. So clearly, although the two indexes, they do correlate quite strongly, there are certain systematic differences. So still looking into it, but my kind of a hunch now, and as much as I've looked at it, is that it is about the structure of affective polarization in different places. I use two examples here. Sweden 2018, which is one of the most polarized according to the Wagner's index, and Hungary 2018, which is one of the most polarized according to my index. But basically, so if you look at the sum of all conflicts, so the Reiljan's index, then Hungary seems way more polarized. I mean, this you don't need to really focus on the specific little numbers in the cells, but the more red is more negative feelings, right? And the more green is more positive. So it seems that the reason why it performs like that is this the logic of the indexes. So that in Sweden, parties conform into blocks. So it's more, it's not, I will get to that in a moment. It's not perfectly two blocks because the far right party is a bit standing away from everyone, but basically you still have two quite large blocks that have positive feelings within the block and negative towards the others. Whereas in Hungary, it's basically like a mayhem. Everyone hates everyone. So the voters of each party, they dislike all other parties. At least in 2018, it was like that. So this, I think, illustrates the different logic of the indexes, and I really leave it as like an open question. So which system, and I'm very happy to take your opinions on it, which system is more polarized? Is it the kind of Swedish one where the parties are divided into camps, let's say two camps ideally, which is kind of the adaptation of the American two-party approach, or is it like kind of like a battle of five armies like in Hungary, where everyone hates everyone, which I see a little bit goes into the direction of like Sartori's polarized pluralism, in which also one of the characteristics of polarized pluralism was bilateral oppositions, meaning that the opposition cannot really unite against the government. And in Hungary, I think this year is a good example because now in 2022, the opposition did try to unite against Fidesz, but it failed. And obviously there might be many reasons, but I think one of the reasons could be that they kind of don't like each other. So they have a common enemy, but it's not that easy to build a coalition when your voters don't like each other. So you can try to change it, but there is clearly a problem. And I think this kind of polarized pluralism approach, where you have more camps than two, could be to democracy even more dangerous in a way that is specifically it can lead to a situation where the opposition is not able to unite, and then it allows like a dominant party to keep power for a long time. I think in Hungary we see this, in Turkey we see this. Turkey also one of the most effectively polarized countries, and also in 2015 they had a chance to push Erdogan out of power, but the opposition couldn't unite because they really hate each other. So I see certain, and I think very much up to discussion, but I see certain ways how this more than two camps could be even more problematic. But also, I mean, obviously, if it's two 50% camps, that could cause different types of problems. But yeah, I'm not giving like an answer here, but I think this is something that like the dialogue or the debate on this topic has still not really emerged, and I think we should kind of think through and very much looking forward to your opinions too, like which one is more polarized? Is it Hungary or is it Sweden? Another like a comparative aspect is towards the populist far right parties. So even in these countries, like especially Western European countries, where parties do conform into blocks, one group tends to stand alone or like kind of unaffiliated with the blocks, and these are the far right populist parties. So they both radiate and receive high levels of dislike towards other parties. which probably is not very surprising, like you could guess that, but I would say two aspects here have attracted my interest at least. One is that this hostility goes beyond ideological disagreements. So even if you kind of try to make a model to explain party feelings, you add like ideological distance there, you still cannot explain away this very strong dislike. So there's something more there. And the other thing is that this dislike is very much asymmetric, meaning that the far right parties, they receive much more dislike from the supporters of other parties, liberal mainstream parties, than vice versa. As Gidron, Adams, and Norm put it, that there's like a large effective penalty exacted on the radical right, and they also show that. And they like when they put into a model a dummy variable, if the evaluated party is far right, and even if you put all kinds of explanatory variables like ideological distance, it still remains that the dummy variable is very strong, meaning that the far right gets more hate, even if you include the ideology. So this is kind of an illustration on it from my new still unpublished paper, where I kind of try to map and explain this. And yeah, it's a bit small here, but this is like the asymmetry, but the countries are listed by the asymmetry. So there's Netherlands and Germany in the top here. So let's say minus 2.8 means that on average in Netherlands in 2017, the PVV voters evaluated other parties out of 0 out of 10 scale 2.8 points higher than other parties evaluated PVV on average. And in Germany with AFD, it was similar, like also like 2.5 point difference. So interestingly, the far right voters don't hate the opponents that much. It's not everywhere like this. In Hungary, in Norway, in Slovakia, it's quite equal. But in a number of countries, it's very much asymmetric. So why is it like this? I'm still trying to pin this down, and where I'm now at with this is that there are certainly certain political norms against what we can call nativism, meaning that if you are in the very anti-immigrant, like nativist end of the scale, you get more hate as compared to when you're in the other, like the most open end of the scale. So, and I guess Germany a good example here. Clearly, like very strong norms against far right. So being in this, let's say, into the tan side of the Galtan dimension, gets you a higher penalty. And the other thing clearly is elite behavior, and also like the models show that if we also add these variables like nativism, populist attitudes, then it's still like how much the elites of other parties treat the far right party as a pariah. That clearly has an effect on how much is it disliked and how strong is this asymmetry. There's of course questions there. Is it a good thing that far right parties are so much ostracized, or are there problems with it? I mean, very much a normative question, and maybe more interesting even could be like, will it remain like this? And I'm sensing that it might be changing because clearly anti-immigration views are becoming more mainstream. That we see in many countries lately. The Netherlands, the Dutch election is a good example. We might have Prime Minister Wilders quite soon, which is clearly a sign of these parties kind of being more accepted. And also in this elite level, these parties are kind of breaking out of this political isolation. So they are treated a bit less as pariahs over time in many countries. So it might be that these parties become in some ways normalized, whether it's good or bad, again, very much debatable. But let's say, to take away from this, I would still say that we have to distinguish between far-right parties and politicians and the voters, as in many of the voters are not at all, at least as the data shows, they are not extremely angry and willing to go and storm the Capitol. Only a few of these far right voters are like that. I think many are rather alienated people from politics who are not incredibly negative towards the out group. So I think again, this distinction between the political and the social dimension is important to keep in mind. And the last thing I want to talk about is precisely this social dimension. So I've collected some data on it. Like in this seminal article of Iyengar et al. 2012, they showed that the party feelings, party thermometers have really decreased, and then they also showed that the social distance, what they call, has increased between different parties. And one of the most striking data points they showed is that around 40%, close to half of the US partisans would be unhappy if their child married a supporter of the out party. So wondering if Europeans also discriminate against the supporters of disliked parties like this. There is some data coming out on that now, but we still don't have a good comparative picture. But yeah, I would say the answer is yes. I collected data in Hungary, Italy, France, and Estonia. And again, that looks a bit small here, but these are all the parties, and the percentage of how many people would be unhappy if their family member married a supporter of the party. So here is Swedish. It's the highest ones are always the far right parties. It's in all of the countries, at least for one of the parties, if it's an out party for you, around 50% of the voters, so similar or even more than in the United States, would be displeased if their child or the family member married a supporter of that party. I also asked about how they feel about the neighbor from the party. Then it's less animosity, but still it gets around 30% in some cases that people would be annoyed in that case. And actually, this even maybe underestimates a bit, because this summarizes all of the people who just don't vote for this party, but also it includes some kind of allied parties. So if you look at more in detail, for example, in Italy, Partito Democratico, the center-left party, among their voters, around 70% would be unhappy if their family member married a Fratelli d'Italia supporter. Again, it's a bit asymmetric. Fratelli d'Italia supporters are around 50% would be unhappy if their family member married a Partito Democratico supporter. But clearly, just to wrap up, clearly the social dimension, the social level discrimination on partisan basis is also present in Europe. And again, I would not say it's in any way lower than in the United States, depending, of course, on a country, but at least in these countries here, it reaches that level. So, but at first, some were saying, yeah, maybe it's just a party, maybe only feelings towards parties are also polarized in Europe. Maybe it doesn't go so much on the social level as in the United States, where partisan identities are way more displayed, with bumper stickers, stuff like that. But I would say no, it does go on social level also in Europe. And yeah, just as a final thing, I think I'm running a bit low on time now, but the relationship between the political and social dimensions is not really linear. So this here on the x-axis is feeling towards the party, y-axis is the in-law evaluation. And the main point here is that only if you give 0 out of 10 when you evaluate the like-dislike of a party, only then you are highly likely to be annoyed by in-law from that out party. But then it makes a huge jump, meaning that if you kind of mildly dislike, or if you give 2 or 3 out of 10 to a party, it's around neutral evaluation. So I think this could have quite important normative implications in a way that we talk about affective polarization as a bad thing usually, but we also know that it might increase voter turnout. There is some data on that. So maybe it is that if you give 8 or 9 out of 10 to your own party and 2 out of 10 to some out parties, it's totally fine. It's like a good type of polarization that keeps you interested in politics and motivated to vote. But at the same time, it makes it quite unlikely that you would discriminate people on a social level. So I think there is still a lot of normative questions open here, but clearly, the relationship is not linear. So there are thresholds from which people start mixing politics into their social lives. So to summarize and maybe throw out some open questions, is that I would say that we have to distinguish between different dimensions of affective polarization. I'm not saying that this is this political social that I propose. I'm not saying that this is a exhaustive list. We can definitely discuss this, but I'm very much arguing for a multidimensional approach to effective polarization. If you want to rank countries or like whatever kind of territories based on the level of effective polarization, which one is most, which one are least polarized, it depends, at least partly, it does depend on how we conceptualize and measure effective polarization. So is it more like, do we see the two camps as the most polarized, or is there more effective camps? If everyone dislikes everyone, do we see this as more polarized? I think this is a topic that is worth discussing both conceptually and looking into it empirically. What are the consequences of different types of polarization? And yes, the structure of partisan feelings clearly differs across countries. In some countries, they really divide, and especially in more established Western democracies, parties tend to divide into affective blocks. Whereas in Central Eastern Europe, it's much less of this kind of alignment. It's more of like overall polarization on all fronts. And maybe for discussion is that is effective polarization a threat to democracy, and which type of effective polarization specifically? If we talk about the political, social ones, or the structure, the two camps or more camps, which types could be more problematic, and could we find ideal level of effective polarization? So we have enough that politics is still interesting to people, but not so much that society will become completely like segregated on partisan basis, and that democracy starts crumbling because people who lose cannot accept that the party they hate will form the government. So yeah, on these questions or anything else that caught your eye in the presentation, I would be very happy to discuss. But I'll end here now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk, Andres.